Hey guys, so procedural generation in games is one of the most interesting topics to me. I recently posted a short video about how I do the procedural generation in my game, DeckTerra, and the response to that has been super awesome. I wanted to show you a little bit more about that process and also talk about why procedural generation techniques are so cool and why this one in particular really works. And hopefully this will give you some inspiration for coming up with new techniques and new algorithms for procedural generation in your game. So what started all of this is I'm working on a grand strategy game, and for this game I needed to procedurally generate a lot of land. And I wanted to have a lot of control over the shape of the continents while also having procedural generation so that each game feels a little bit different. And the process I ended up using was to simulate the movement of tectonic plates in order to shape the continents in my game. And tectonic plates are just kind of these giant slabs of rock that push against each other and form continents in the real world. So by simulating them in the procedural generation process, we can use the information that we get from the tectonic plates in order to inform a lot of decisions. For example, in my game, I generate mountain ranges along the intersections of tectonic plates because in real life, mountains are formed by the intersection of tectonic plates pushing land upwards into like this kind of mountain shape. And I think the piece about this technique that's so cool and really resonates with people is that it's generating natural looking formations by using the science behind how those formations are generated in the real world. And that not only leads to great results for the procedural generation, but also kind of makes a cool story behind it. And where this all started for me was reading this article from the devs of Civilization 7. They talk about how they used a similar technique in Civ 7 to generate interesting shapes for continents, and they outline the loose approach of how they generate the maps using this process. So they use the Voronoi noise. They don't really say it here because they're very vague about it, but they use a flooding algorithm, I imagine, in order to get those tectonic plates to like push up against each other. Yeah, so each plate gets a random rotation and movement direction. So this is a little different to what I did. I didn't actually make the plates like rotate and move in a certain direction. I just made them grow using a flooding algorithm. And if you want to know more about this algorithm, I'll leave a link to a Wikipedia article in the description. It's called jump flooding. A flooding algorithm is basically a way to fill up space using some kind of seed position. So you choose an initial position on a noise grid or on a texture, and then using some parameters, that position expands and influences the values of its neighbors. So this is commonly done for distance fields. In order to determine the distance away from an object, you use a flooding algorithm. But you can also use it on Voronoi cells, which is what I'm doing in my procedural generation. And we'll look at the code in a bit and we'll go over that and what it looks like. But it's cool that the devs on Civ 7 used the more realistic interpretation of tectonic plates, which is giving them a specific direction to move in, which is kind of how they work in real life. And then they use a higher density Voronoi grid to draw the actual continent shapes. They also do this cool thing where they add coastline, mountains, and volcanoes based on the intersections of tectonic plates, which is where I got that idea for my process. The frustrating part about this is they don't tell you the specifics of how they have that algorithm that grows the islands. I imagine it's probably patented. And I want to show you guys a bit about my interpretation of this algorithm in this process and where it differs. Let's dive into this. I'm going to show you guys what that looks like in my game, and then we'll look into the code and the shaders, and I'll show you the full process. So you can use this in your own games, you can copy it. After the map is generated in my game, this is the result. So you can see that each continent in this example is kind of like a different biome. The continents are generated after the tectonic plates are generated, and then the biomes are assigned to the continents after all that. So let's take a look at the code. Let's see what it looks like. So I've got this map system, which is responsible for everything related to the map in my game. And when it generates the map, it does it based on a profile that I provided. And that profile is defined in a scriptable object. Here, depending on what the profile is, the settings for how the map should look are different. And the reason I do this is I want to provide different options to the player when they start the game as to what kind of map to use. So the basic one is standard, and I define all of these constants. We'll go over each of them and what they kind of mean and what they're doing. But there's also one called islands, which is more sparse, and one called wasteland, which is more like deserts and tundras and has less water overall. When the map is generated, it's done based on one of those profiles. And all the profile data is passed into my Voronoi map generator, which does pretty much everything. The first thing that map generation algorithm does is it creates a grid of Voronoi cells like this. So you can see this like overlaid grid on my map here. Imagine this, but all the same color. So at the start, it's all white. Then what I do is I go through and I give it starting points for each tectonic plate. So this is the tectonic plate grid, and it's Voronoi cells, which if you're not familiar with Voronoi cells, you should read up on them. They're really, really cool. But they're used in a lot of procedural generation, and it's a form of noise. And it forms these kind of spiderweb looking holes. So given the start points, and the start points I just kind of distribute evenly depending on how many tectonic plates I want, and that's a parameter in the map generation settings. I give it a bunch of start points, and then I randomly assign each start point a strength. And what these are the initial positions of the tectonic plates and how strong those tectonic plates should grow. Then I have this algorithm I call jump flooding. All this jump flooding algorithm is doing is it's saying for each starting point, for each tectonic plate, expand out and turn all of your neighbors into your color. Let's say I'm this tectonic plate in the top left, this pink one. So my starting position might be this cell over here, like this big one. And at each iteration of the jump flooding algorithm, it's going to look at all of its neighbors, which are all these ones over here, and it's going to say, turn them pink. And then eventually it'll do that again, so it'll turn another circle pink and another one, and all the other tectonic plates are doing the same. So they're all kind of expanding out, looking at all of their neighbors and saying, if those neighbors don't have a color yet, turn them my color. And in computer science, we call this breadth first search. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. What you need to understand is that from each seed point, which is the starting point of each tectonic plate, the jump flooding algorithm expands to all the neighbors every step. And then when it encounters a tile that is already occupied by a different tectonic plate, it clashes and it says, okay, am I stronger than the other tectonic plates? So remember, we gave each plate a strength value, which is randomly generated number from 0 to 1. If the tectonic plate that's clashing with the other plate is stronger, then it takes that other plate's cell. So if this green one is expanding out and this pink one's expanding out and they have a conflict here, whichever one has a higher strength gets that cell. And that's it. After that, you have this grid and each of the pieces are split into plates. If you understand that piece, you understand this whole procedural generation process. So all it is Voronoi noise and jump flooding. So after that's done, we have our tectonic plates and we're done with that piece. Now we're ready to start making the continent. So we do the exact same thing. We make another grid of Voronoi noise, but this time it's a little more dense. You can see all the cells are smaller. Imagine this is fully populated with all these cells. And again, they're all just one color at the start. So they're all white. They're all uninitialized. And then again, we place seed points for each continent, and those are dependent on random places. Currently, how it's working is that they're random at a fixed distance away from the center position of the grid. So all the starting points are in a circle centered at the middle of the grid. And we start this algorithm a little differently. We start it by initializing every single cell in the Voronoi grid for the continents as water. And water has a fixed resistance factor, which is how strong the water is, so that when the water conflicts with a continent that's trying to expand into the water has a fixed resistance to that continent. So in the previous flooding algorithm with the tectonic plates and the larger cells, if a tile is uninitialized and a tectonic plate attempts to expand into that tile, it gets that tile for free, so it puts up no resistance. But in the continents version, it puts up a little bit of resistance. The other difference we have here is that as the continents get farther away from their starting position in the flooding algorithm, they lose power. So they can only expand to a certain distance before the water puts up too much resistance and doesn't let them expand any further. Because if we didn't do that, then the tiles would expand through the entire grid and all of it would be land, there'd be no ocean. This part about water having resistance and expanding based on the distance away from the seed point is just something I came up with to limit the tiles from expanding to become a giant monocontinent, but I'm sure there's a better way to do this that's grounded in real earth science. So if you know anything about geology and you have a better way of doing this, please comment it below. I'd be super interested to hear about it. But this algorithm works for my purposes. The third factor that changes between the tectonic plate flooding algorithm and the continent flooding algorithm is that in the continent flooding algorithm, we have this variable, continent plate alignment factor. And what this says is that continents have a tough time overcoming the barriers of tectonic plates. And why do we do this? Let's look at this in the world map. So if we look up tectonic plates, you might notice something about all the tectonic plates in our natural world, or most of them, is that generally coastlines have an easier time forming around the barriers between tectonic plates. So South America is a great example. If you go up the west coast or up the west coast of North America, you see that most of the coastline follows this line between the tectonic plates. Same is true between the line between Africa and Europe and this part over here, which is like the ring of fire. So what this means for this procedural generation is that we want some way for the continents to align with the tectonic plates that they're on top of. And my way of doing this is through the continent plate alignment factor. If we look at here, is saying for the heuristic that determines which tile wins when two tiles are competing for space, I pass both of those to this method to determine who wins. And I see which tectonic plate both of those cells are on. And if they're different, I provide like an advantage to the continent that started on the same tectonic plate as the tile they're fighting for. So if the Atlantic Ocean and the North American continent are fighting over California, then I say, well, California is on the same tectonic plate as where America started, which let's say it's Washington. And so when it's expanding out, I give an advantage to the American continent to take California from the ocean, if that makes sense, which probably none of that made sense. But essentially all that means is that two tiles that exist on the same tectonic plate should be on the same continent, unless there's multiple continents that start on the same tectonic plate, in which case they have an equal footing. And those are the three differences between the tectonic plate flooding algorithm and the continent flooding algorithm. The grid is denser, so smaller Voronoi cells for the continents than for the tectonic plates. We have water resistance. So all tiles start as ocean, which is kind of its own continent, and that continent puts up resistance. Continents lose power as they grow distant from their starting position. So it gets harder and harder for them to expand the larger they are. And we encourage continents to gain tiles that are on the same tectonic plate as the one they started on. And that's done through the continent plate alignment factor. So there's actually 4 differences, but I hope you're still with me. Now that all that's done, there's only one step, which is picking where to put the mountains and the islands on the map. And in the real world, like I mentioned earlier, mountains and islands are often formed at the intersection of tectonic plates. So if you look at the Ring of Fire, this is a natural island formation along an intersection of 2 tectonic plates that is pretty easy to track all the way from like New Zealand up to Alaska, and then sort of it's all in one continent in America, but you can see that a lot of islands are formed along those intersections. So it makes sense to make islands form more frequently along those intersections as well. The other thing that's formed along those intersections is mountains and volcanoes. And this is a map of volcanoes, I think, along those tectonic plates. So you can privilege the positions that are at the intersections of those plates when you're spawning mountains and volcanoes. All I do for that is while I'm going through the tectonic plate flooding algorithm, I mark all the tiles that change hands from one tectonic plate to another, and then those become the possible locations for mountains or islands. And those are determined randomly based on some like simplex noise, which is like, you could do this with just like a random number. And so I have factors for tweaking them. How many mountains, how many islands. The only place where they can exist is on the fault lines between tectonic plates. And so if you look at this overlay I've done, you can see that all the green stuff, you see like the blue and the green have a border here, and those are different continents. So this one is like a tundra continent, and this one is more of a grasslands. And there can be multiple continents within a tectonic plate, but it's less likely. And you can see if you look at the intersections between these plates, or the places where the cells change color, those are the places where the mountains are. So this mountain range in particular is the very corner of the map. There's like 10 mountains all in one clump, and that's exactly at the border between this purple area and this blue area. I have a Voronoi cell map. So after all that process is done, I have a Voronoi cell map that tells me where my continents are, and I have to go through that, and I have to use some kind of profile, which is called a biome profile, which I've created, and that determines what types of tiles get spawned on that continent. So it's pretty simple for now, but I'll show you what these look like. So I've got a couple biomes here. So there's a plains biome, a desert biome, a tundra biome, and a dungeon, which I won't talk about yet, but that's something I'm working on. And depending on these profiles, they have different probabilities of being different tile types. So the tundra biome, for example, has 2 tile types that it can spawn, which are tundra tiles and plains tiles, and it spawns them at a probability of 0.8 and 0.2 respectively. So 80% chance of a tundra tile, 20% chance of a plains tile. And I make sure that that noise is continuously distributed over the continent by using Perlin noise, it's also called simplex noise, to make sure that those things are continuous. So that when I have a little spot of plains tiles, it's accompanied by a few plains tiles in a clump, and not just scattered plains tiles in random positions all over the place. This looks a little more natural. Now that that's done, I just place the mountains and the islands based on a similar procedural technique along, like I said, the fault lines. And at that point, we're done. That's the process. We started with a grid of Voronoi cells that generates tectonic plates, and they use the flooding algorithm to compete for space. Then I did the same flooding algorithm on a more dense grid with some special rules for where water is, and adding limits to how far a continent can expand out so that it can't just like take over the entire map. And I also made those continents follow the lines from the tectonic plates underneath them. And then we sprinkle in mountains and islands, and we populate each continent with the biome type that it is assigned. And that determines the actual type of the tiles in that continent. And we use some random noise to make those things look a little more natural. So I hope you guys found that interesting. That's the breakdown for the whole procedural generation process in my game. If you want to see more content like this, let me know in the comments. I'm definitely open to doing more tutorial style stuff in the future and showing my process. If you're so inclined, go check out the game on Steam. The screenshots are all pretty out of date right now, but it's a roguelike deck builder grand strategy game. So you expand an empire and build units and upgrade your cities, but also build your deck over time and cast spells to improve your production and fend off enemies. So check it out and give it a wish list if you're interested. If you want to playtest the game, we've got a great group of people on the Discord server. And I just want to thank everybody for joining the Discord server and signing up to be a playtester. It's been really sick to hang out with you guys in there and get your feedback on what I'm working on. And we're running some playtests over the next couple of weeks, so if you want to check it out and get a Steam key, definitely join the Discord with the link in the description. Yeah, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. See you guys.